Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Williams, and I'm the Program Director for the San Antonio African American Community Archives and Museum. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to our topic today entitled Burial Grounds, Exploring African American Resting Places. Today is going to be very, very intriguing, interesting, and exciting. So I'm glad to get started. Again, welcome everyone to the presentation. I'd like to get started with a little bit of housekeeping. If you do have questions, we ask and invite you to type them into the Q&A area. And if you'd like to direct them to a particular panelist, please put that panelist's name and then your question, and we will get to them as soon as possible. The other information that I'd like to let you know about is we've got a lot of interesting things coming up with SAAACAM, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce who's going to be speaking with you today. We have our moderator, that is Clinton McKenzie. And Clinton has been involved in prehistoric and historic archaeology projects since 1978. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts and Master of Arts from UTSA and a Master of Science from Trinity, and is a doctoral candidate at UTSA. He's currently serving as an archaeological steward for the Texas Historical Commission and project archaeologist and archivist for the UTSA Center for Archaeological Research. Scott Baird is one of our panelists. He's received his doctorate in linguistics at the University of Texas in Austin with postdoctoral research at Oxford University in England. At present, as an associate member of the Bexar County Historical Commission, he serves as chair of the Cemetery Committee. Our next panelist is David Carlson. Dr. Carlson worked formerly as an assistant professor of U.S. and Latin American history at the University of Texas Pan American. Dr. Carlson is currently the archivist of the Bexar County Spanish Archives. As deputy of the county clerk, he has served Bexar County, Texas since 2012. Our next panelist is Everett Fly. Everett is the co-founder of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. He has practiced for 40 years as a self-employed licensed landscape architect and architect. He earned the 5-year professional Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Texas at Austin and the Master in Landscape Architecture from Harvard University. President Barack Obama awarded him one of 10 2014 National Humanities Medals for his body of work preserving the integrity of African American places and landmarks. And next we'll have Shawn Marceaux. Shawn has more than 20 years of experience in the fields of archaeology and cultural resources management. He has worked in academics, federal agencies, and the private sector, and has conducted fieldwork in Texas, the southeastern United States, California, and Europe. He currently serves as the city archaeologist for the City of San Antonio's Office of Historic Preservation. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists and our moderator. And without further ado, I'd like to bring on Clinton McKenzie as moderator.
Hi, good morning. Can everybody hear me? Thank you for joining us this morning and joining the panel and helping to promote SAAACAM's programming, which I always enjoy. I wanted to kind of quickly put the bookends on what we're going to talk about today because it's quite a lot. First of all, we're going to start out with I'll give an overview of San Antonio cemeteries, the history of like historic cemeteries, where they're at, with how they work, what's different about them over time, followed by a discussion that'll get into some of the issues related to cemetery law. We have a number of panelists that have a lot of experience with that. We're also going to talk about some of the recent rediscoveries of African American cemeteries here in Bexar County, as well as the archaeology that has been associated with those. And we're also going to kind of finish up with talking about research and how to do research and be involved. rediscovering and educating ourselves about African-American cemeteries and African-American communities in San Antonio. What I will do is I'll start out with a discussion on historic cemeteries now, and then we'll come back and I'll hand it over to Everett Fly for some of his commentary. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in, but we'll get to them at the Q&A portion of the show, so to speak. Let me see if I can't share my screen here. Okay, here we go. So one of the things that we wanted to frame this, because before we talk about African-American cemeteries, you kind of need to understand or, see how everything is situated and how things have been over time and how they changed over time. And so I'm going to be talking about cemeteries from the earliest period of San Antonio's European historic history, European and African, from 1718 up until the 1960s. And the things we're going to talk about is why people are buried and why that changes, where people get buried and why that changes over time. We're also going to talk about how people are buried and how that changes over time, as well as who is being buried. There's a lot of differences and changes that are pretty interesting that happen over the course of our history here. And I think they might be surprising to some of you. They certainly were to me. So this is simply a chart that divides between generally religious reasons, Catholic or Protestant, but also in the later period when we start having cemeteries by group affiliation or community affiliation. And it's ordered by time, so starting in 1718 and going to 1853 to the present. And so the why of where people are buried, generally it starts out with religious reasons. People are buried in cemeteries by religious affiliation. And then over time that changes to having reasons for memorializing people, as well as people being buried according to the communities that they're in. Sometimes that's a community based on race, sometimes that's a community based on fraternal organization affiliation, and those sorts of things. And then as we get into, that's both in Catholic as well as in non-Catholic and Protestant and community type cemeteries. And then the where of where people are buried changes, and then how. Sometimes people are buried just in shrouds, sometimes they're buried in coffins. And then who's allowed to be buried in certain cemeteries.
Clinton?
Yeah.
Your screen share is not on.
It's not on. It was on a second ago.
Yep, it's not.
I see it now. Just a second. Yeah, it got moved over for some reason. I don't know why. Is it there now?
Still no.
It says I am.
Bingo.
It's on now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for catching that. And so this is the chart that I was explaining with you not being able to see it. My apologies. So when we talk about the Spanish colonial period, there were lots of cemeteries in San Antonio. Each one of the missions had a cemetery. We also had a cemetery for the parish church, the cemetery for the Presidio. And this is a map from 1767 that just shows, the basic location of these numerous cemeteries associated with these Spanish colonial sites. One of the things that I find interesting is that the first extant recorded burial that we have from that period, there were earlier ones, but we lost the records. But the first record that we have of a burial in the colonial period is of an African soldier from the Presidio de Bexar who was buried at San Antonio de Valero, or what we now call the Alamo, and his name was Juan Blanco. So when we talk about changing time and burials, this is a picture of San Fernando Church before, from the 1860s, before it became a cathedral and was rebuilt. But that wall, that low wall you see around the front of the church and going to the back, that was a cemetery. But also, in addition to that cemetery in the front and on the sides, people were also buried in the church. And so this is a difference that changes over time, is that you have people, this is a burial practice of that period where people are being buried actually in the church or buried around it. So this continued up until about 1805. And what happened then was, because the population had risen so much in San Antonio, people were being buried in the church, and it became so, smelly and uncomfortable that everybody had to change it. And so they decided it was time to build a new camposanto, a new burial yard. And so one of the things we'll notice about cemeteries over time is they move. So here we've got, number one is the church burials, and it's now being moved to further away from the church to this holy field or camposanto where people are being buried. And that begins in 1808. And I just want to make a note down here, the governor of Texas, who's being addressed as Cordero, and he's being told by the commandant of the province that everybody can be buried there indiscriminately. And what that means is not just on the basis of race, but also on the basis of occupation, et cetera. Everybody was buried in the common ground. But that camposanto also filled up rather quickly. This was a description of that camposanto in 1842 by a member of the Texas militia, a man named H.A. Adams. And he describes it here, and it's a pretty graphic description, but the purpose of doing it is to talk about differences about religious and cultural practices and how they've changed over time. Here, it's describing all of these bones being being exposed and around the churchyard. We always approach things with the way we see it, and the reality is that at this time, when you died, you were buried, and you didn't have a dedicated plot. That's something that changes over time, and so it's an indiscriminate burial yard for the members of the parish. And this is just an image here showing, when they expanded this camposanto on the corner in 1848, they made it an even larger cemetery, and they made a city cemetery, first city cemetery south of it. And if you're curious about where that's located, it's the one in purple. The Catholic cemetery is underneath Santa Rosa Hospital today, and the city cemetery is underneath Milam Park today. So those cemeteries too didn't stay open until the mid 1850s, and then they moved. And so what I've showed on this slide is where they've moved to. So the blue line marks where the city cemetery is being moved over to the East Side Cemetery Complex, which Everett's going to speak about. And then the Roman Catholic burial yard becomes San Fernando #1 today. And it gets moved out onto the west side. Both of these are outside of town when that happens. And they're part of what is called the cemetery or sanitary movement. And it was a desire to get burial yards outside of cities for both sanitary reasons and to have beautified cemeteries. This is where you start having cemeteries with dedicated plots, dedicated with tombstones and markers, and more of what we think of cemeteries today. So now at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Everett Fly, and he can speak a little bit more about the city cemeteries themselves.
Good morning. Can everyone see and hear me?
Yes, we can see you, Everett.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Thank you, Clint, for that historical background. That saves us some time. And the part that I want to talk about for a few minutes is the kind of the formal planning for the East Side Cemetery complex, which is bordered on the east by New Braunfels and straddles Commerce. leading up to the,
Excuse me, Everett. Clinton, will you stop sharing your screen, please? It's at the very top, that red bar.
oh. Okay. Um, in the modern times, as Clint mentioned, once we get into the modern times and the East Side Cemetery complex begins to develop, different groups and organizations began to fill in the tract of land, the 103-acre tract of land. But it's done on it's kind of a semi-casual basis. In other words, there's no guidelines for everybody to follow. Some of the organizations or families that have money are able to maintain their individual plots. Some of the fraternal organizations are able to put up fences, excuse me, and gates with the names of the organizations. And this goes on for many years until we get into the late 80s, and the city of San Antonio begins to recognize that there needs to be some consistent order to the process. So I had the opportunity to serve on a master planning team, led by Landmark Partnership, Hillary Saunders and Richard Mahadine. I was the landscape architect for the project. Mr. K.M. Ng was the civil engineer, and Mariah Watson was the historian, and Jim Saunders was the attorney that helped us with the legal issues. And so in general, as I mentioned, my role was to look at ways to bring order to things like the fences. There was a piecemeal effort to maintain the fences. Some of them were in good repair. Some of them were chain link fences. Some of them were cast iron or wrought iron. But again, no order. Some of the paths were meandered across the site. Some of them were on a rectilinear pattern. So paths were important. Signage, as I said, some of the gates had signs inside the cemetery. There was a different character and qualities of signage. And then of course the plant materials. Some families and organizations had planted what some people call a witness tree. In other words, a tree that would grow to eventually be a large landmark so that you could actually find the plot or find the boundaries of the plots. And then of course, maintenance. The Parks Department was in charge of the maintenance, but there were some individual plot owners and managers that provided their own maintenance. So we spent more of, I want to say, the better part of a year researching, cross-referencing, comparing notes, and identifying like lists and rosters of people that were buried there. And of course, the lists and the rosters include several African-American plots. City Cemetery 3 is not the only African-American plot. For example, the St. Peter Claver represented the Black Catholics, and the United Brothers of Friendship also represented an African-American fraternal organization. So again, the idea was to bring kind of an equal standard for all of the plots, an equal standard for maintenance, an equal standard for historic documentation, an equal standard for physical appearance and character. And it resulted in a final report, which of course is in the city archive records, and I believe there's a copy at the main library. But that was the purpose of the master plan, was to bring equal standard to all of the plots, including the African-American plots. So that's a quick summary. It was a challenging project, but we learned a lot, not just about the cemeteries as a sacred landscape, but about the cemeteries as a collective historic resource. There were a number of groups at that time that were becoming interested in providing cemetery tours. And that was also kind of at the background of what we were doing, is to, when a group came, there would be some kind of order. They could find the plots, they could find their way on designated paths, and enjoy that kind of cultural landscape. So once again, that's the summary of the cemetery master plan. That was in 1990, and I'm happy to say that the city and county have continued to follow some of the guidelines that we set out. So thanks, Clint. That's my part, right now on the cemeteries, the East Side Cemetery Complex.
Thank you very much, Everett. Again, under Q&A, you can ask questions now, and we'll see them in the sidebar. And if we can answer them now, we will. And if we can answer them at the end or elaborate on them in the end, we'll do that as well. So just because we're moving on to a new topic doesn't mean you can't ask a question. So the next topic we're going to kind of go over a little bit is cemetery law, and the kinds of questions that we're hoping that we can elicit answers to and find out your interests is, to explain what kind of rules and regulations are in place for the maintenance and protection of cemeteries, both public and private, as well as historic cemeteries on private property, and maybe how that's changed a little bit over time. Kind of what's different about requiring a cemetery that's called a perpetual care cemetery versus a non-perpetual care. We're also concerned about making sure people understand what their rights and opportunities are to access private cemeteries on private property when you have family buried there. And how can your rights and prerogatives be protected or promoted? Help us kind of discuss some of those questions is Dr. Scott Baird, who I'll turn it over to now. And we're also ready to help answer questions on that same topic. So thank you. Scott, if you'll unmute and then turn on your video. Thanks.
Mr. Baird, you're still muted.
Unmuting. There we go. Got it. All right. The most important thing I can say is if you can get online with the Texas Historical Commission, and they have a separate section on cemeteries that has probably 50 or 60 documents that explain in detail anything that you need to know about how to preserve cemeteries, who can professionally fix cemeteries. The most important, the two main laws we have is that number one, if there is one body in the ground, that is a cemetery. And all you have to do is contact the city clerk, and David, you need to tell me who that is, and say, I found this cemetery and it's protected, protected from developers.
Scott?
Yes.
That's the county clerk.
County clerk, okay.
Yeah, so the Bexar County clerk right now is Ms. Lucy Adame Clark, and you can file a notice about a cemetery through the deed records. That's how it's filed at the Bexar County Courthouse.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, Jenny McWilliams is in charge of the cemeteries, and she recognizes 5 different types of cemeteries. Perpetual care is probably the safest that everything will be taken care of. Associations, cemetery associations or family associations keep up the cemeteries quite well. Churches and societies have different, this is what Everett was talking about. By the way, Everett, the most intriguing Black cemetery I ever found in the cities is the Sisters of Ruth. And it took me 3 years to discover that they are a group of Black women proud of their anonymity. So it's impossible for a white guy to find out who they were. And then abandoned cemeteries, and then absolutely lost cemeteries. At present, all of these cemeteries, even just one that you find in a pasture, are protected by anyone destroying that cemetery as long as it is registered, which is what I was trying to say earlier, and Dave told you how to do that. However, you can apply to have any cemetery designated through the state historical commission. That costs, the last I heard, $25. It's a lot of work. You have to get the deeds. You have to have exact location. You have to have some history of the cemetery. I've never seen one turned down because of lack of history, but the history has to be at least 50 years old to do that. Once that's designated, my only job is to go out and actually see that it's there. And so the state will tell me, Scott, go out at such and such a place, and is the cemetery actually there? After that, the county is out of the process. Then it can have an historical designation, a historical marker. That is a totally different process, and it costs quite a bit more because you have to pay for the marker. But anyway, those are the two processes, and that's the only thing that the Bexar County Historical Commission is charged with doing. However, if you go to that same website, and I also have a local one, they have a list of professional people who can, well, everything in the world, restore, mainly restore broken markers. So there's a huge list of people that can help with restoration. The only other law is that if you know of a cemetery and it's on somebody else's property, by law, they have to let you in. You have to give them at least 2 weeks notice if there's not easy access. Out in the country where most of the cemeteries are that I look at, that people are very, very friendly. No one's ever fussed at me for wanting to get in, but they do want to protect fences and gates and stuff so cows don't get out. But that is controlled not by the county, but that's controlled by the mortuary societies, the morticians. They're the ones that have to have access to the cemetery, and so they can have legal clout. Now then, the Texas Historical Commission does not enforce any of the laws. Preservation, vandalism, they don't do that. That all has to be done by local, particularly sheriffs. We had a case here in San Antonio where a company moved over, destroyed a family cemetery and left, I think there were 7 markers. David, you were involved in that one with the Heritage family. We finally got a lawyer who took them to court, and it turned out that was the first time in the state of Texas that anybody ever went to civil court to complain about vandalism of a cemetery. I still don't know if that's ever been absolved or not. But that has to be done with the sheriff, and the other one has to be done, the access has to be done through the mortuary societies. I think that's basically it. The details are written out online at Texas Historical Commission /cemeteries.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baird. Appreciate the knowledge and sharing it with folks. There is quite a lot of information online, as he has discussed, at the Texas Historical Commission. So Scott, if you could turn your video off. At this time, I'd like to open it up to the rest of the panel. We have a few more minutes on this topic. If anyone else would like to address cemetery law, cemetery access questions here before we move on to the next topic. So that you can speak now or forever hold your peace, or at least hold your peace to the Q&A section.
Hi, this is Shawn. I just want to sort of reiterate what Dr. Baird said. I've worked with Jenny McWilliams at the THC for years, and she's a great resource. She can help out. You know, we've touched on access to cemeteries, and she has got a document I think she shared with me and others on sort of a process, 2-3-step process that people can take when they suspect or know that there's a cemetery present and they want to visit. So again, just wanted to reiterate, it's a great resource, and she's great to work with. So please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. So at this point, we're going to move on to our third topic, which is recently rediscovered cemeteries. That's going to be addressed both by Everett Fly and by Dr. Marceau. Everett has been instrumental in the rediscovery, examination, and protection of some of these cemeteries, and I'd like to turn it over to him first to perhaps set the stage, and then to Shawn Marceau to talk about recent archaeology that's been done at some of those sites. So thank you, Everett.
Thanks again, Clint. The family cemeteries that I've been working on recently that have been rediscovered mostly came through oral interviews. In other words, talking to different families about information they had, particularly in the county, but there are a couple of within the city limits now. And in the discussion, a family would mention, or a family member would mention that they had grown up as a young person helping to maintain the cemetery, or they actually attended a funeral in an outlying cemetery. And then I began to ask if they would give me a description of the route. How did they get to the cemetery? Or do they remember the name of a funeral home or mortician that worked with them? And that's how they came about. I think the one that Dr. Marceau is going to talk about is the Winter Jackson Cemetery. It's in far north Bexar County, near the intersection of Nacogdoches Road and Loop 1604. And that's exactly how that came about. I was talking to the Winters family descendants about property that they actually owned in that area. And Mr. Dan Winters began to explain how he used to go out and help maintain his family cemetery. But they had lost track of it because the natural markers, the roads and the trees and so forth that they used to use as navigation points or reference points had been changed so much by the 1604 construction and the commercial development. But Dan Winters was able to give me enough of a description that I could go back to historic maps, and fortunately I was able to actually find a deed for the sale of the property, and the deed described the property, but it said that this property is sold save and except for the Negro Cemetery, and that description included a meets and bounds description of the boundaries of the cemetery, and so that's what allowed us to find it. So from that point, I was able to get in touch with Dr. Marceau, and he was able to pick up with his team, and I'll turn it over to him now for whatever he wants to share with you.
Thank you, Everett. I'm going to try and share screens here. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Great, thank you. So just wanted to very quickly thank SAAACAM for the invitation, opportunity to participate today. Such an interesting and important topic, and hoping to convey how archaeologists can help and be a part of this process. So just briefly, the city has review authority on various projects in the area. So there's different levels of oversight. So this is how sometimes we come to be involved in projects, federal projects, for example, like Mission Reach along the river, or a housing development that receives HUD funding. These would all trigger the National Historic Preservation Act, which would have some, which also would flow down to the city. If it's on city-owned property, then the project would follow under the Antiquities Code of Texas, administered by the Texas Historical Commission. So there's those state laws, as well as the Texas Health and Safety Code, which I Google often and read and reread the Health and Safety Code multiple times a year because it's very useful and is a big part of the process. And then locally, we have the Unified Development Code. So a project that, if there's a platting project or a master development plan or public works project, they may come in front of the city archaeologist. We'll review to see if there are any possible cemeteries in the area, and then can require investigations to ensure that no projects are taking place on top of a cemetery. And this comes up more often than one would think. So it is, again, an important process that hopefully catches issues before they become too big. But sort of just some of the archaeological objectives and approaches that we take. Archaeologists essentially, when they are called out to the field, they're there to sort of assess this site conditions, determine cemetery boundaries if possible. A lot of, as Clinton can attest to, a lot of the research happens well before you enter the field, and looking at early plats, early historic maps, and those kinds of things to try and identify grave cemeteries. Then while in the field, looking for grave markers, graves, any artifacts that may be on the surface, or sort of any features known to be related to the cemetery. Field approaches that archaeologists use include pedestrian survey, which is essentially just systematically walking over the area to look for, again, gravestones or anything that would indicate that there is a cemetery present. Another technology that archaeologists use is remote sensing. So ground penetrating radar, magnetometer, there's several different technologies that can be used that are non-invasive, so you don't have to dig, and they can be very successful. Some of it is based on, some of the success might be based on the soils and other environmental conditions, but it can be a good, again, non-invasive way to locate cemeteries. Another approach is mechanical scraping. So this is especially in areas where we don't fully understand the boundary of a cemetery. Scraping to sort of to try to identify pits, burial pits, is an important method to use, and then screening soils that may be on site. So I'll give you a couple of examples of those as from recent projects in Bexar County in San Antonio, Everett just mentioned, and both of the two projects I'm going to cover were brought to my attention by Everett Fly. So he was responsible for finding them, and then we just sort of helped in some of the field methods. And archaeologists also can be quite adept at going through the archives, or often have researchers on staff like Clinton McKenzie who help find out some of this information even before we get into the field. So this is the Hockley Cemetery, Hockley Clay Cemetery. You can see on the left side of the screen a modern aerial. On the right side of the screen is a near 1930s what's called the Stoner maps. And you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but up here in the right-hand corner, you can see the property that was owned by Mary Hockley. The cemetery would be up in the top right corner. Here's a zoomed in version of the Stoner map with the outline of the cemetery. And then the Stoner maps also have aerial photography. And so that's, you're seeing both the map, drawn in map, and the aerial photography on the right. This is a composite of images. Actually, Clint, thank you for putting this together. This is a great sort of visualization of the changes over time of the property that we can look at to try to see what has happened to the cemetery over time. One of the key takeaways from this is found in the difference between 1966 and 1973, where you can see the cemetery was cleared, where you have trees and vegetation, somewhat dense vegetation. In 1966, by 1973, that area had been cleared. So while we don't see the sort of resolution where you can see what happened to any headstones or whatnot, obviously there had been serious disturbance to the site. So on this particular project, we didn't do any subsurface investigation, so there was no digging, in other words, but we did document evidence of a cemetery on the surface, and so documented some of those things. And we're able to sort of go in, again, I think add to what was available in terms of archives and maps and visuals, and then document different features that were present on the site. The second project I want to briefly cover is the Winters-Jackson Cemetery. So again, brought to us by Everett Fly. This one was, let's see here. Sorry, this was dedicated in 1908 and used. Oh, sorry, wrong one. So this was, I'm sorry, in use from 1876 to 1937. So, and that's based on a gravestone at Holy Cross Cemetery, which is what you see on the right. Back in the 80s, a previous landowner had relocated human remains and headstones to this cemetery without a permit. And so the purpose of this archaeological investigation was sort of to determine whether any of the graves remained or anything had been left behind. You'll essentially, there were still back dirt piles on the site. And so I apologize. I know the image on the left is a little blurry, but just wanted to highlight, you see the green dots at the top of the area. So the red line indicates the proposed cemetery boundaries. The green dots were back dirt piles that were left, sort of push piles, when presumably when the cemetery was relocated. So we went through those, screened the back dirt piles, and then excavated trenches. The long yellow or tan strips that you see are backhoe trenches, scrapes that we made. Often these historic cemeteries, often burials extend outside of sort of the defined area of the historic cemetery. This could be done for any number of reasons. They just, may have filled up and didn't have space, so they started burying people outside of the boundaries. Sometimes you had paupers or other folks who wouldn't have had necessarily the means to maybe pay for a plot if that was the case. And so one of the things we do is scrape to determine whether or not the cemetery extends outside of the boundaries as we know them. There were also documented, there's a cedar post on the northwest corner you see in the top right, and then a cut stone marker on the bottom right side of the page that indicated the northeast boundary. So here's some of the here's some field photos of the excavations, investigations that took place. You see trenching that took place on the left, and then screening that took place on the right. And we were able to find evidence of human remains. There were some human remains, bones found on the site, as well as some artifacts that would have been associated with the burials. So thumb screws that would have, essentially coffin hardware and other artifacts associated with the burials, handles, presumably that would have been mounted on the caskets. And so all of this, led us to determine that there were in fact some remains left. It's unclear how much, but the fact that stuff is present is important, and I think a strong justification for preserving the area, which I believe is going to happen. So, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Shawn, and also Everett, for that information. Both of those cemeteries were African-American cemeteries, or are African-American family cemeteries. Both of them are in far northeastern Baird County, basically in the area of Wetmore Road and Thousand Oaks, Nacogdoches Road area. So to kind of get you situated with those locations. And both of them, the family's involvement in in that geographic area of Baird County goes back into the 1870s, so post Reconstruction. So a long history of African American communities and those cemeteries out in that particular area. Both of those projects are reported by UTSA, the Center for Archaeological Research. And the public portions of those reports are available on our website. So if you were to go to type in UTSA CAR into a Google browser and look for publications, both of those cemetery reports are on our website and you can read them. And they are in the 400s. So we have them broken out into 100, 200, 300, 400 series reports. And if you'll just go look in the 400s, both of those reports are available for you to take a look at, as well as any number of reports. We have nearly 500 archaeological reports that we've done in the last 43 years. And so there's quite a lot of information there that might be of use and of interest to you. We're getting close to starting the Q&A for all of you that are here. There's been a couple of questions that I've seen come in and some that have been answered, and I thought I might try to address some of the ones that were more common just to begin with. There were some questions about my comments earlier about cemeteries being moved. And so it's important to make a distinction here between moving a cemetery function, like where we're burying people, to a new location. Like we had, I showed the slide that showed the movement of the city's public cemeteries to the east side in 1853, and that the parish of San Fernando moved its cemetery to the far west side with the opening of San Fernando #1 around 1855 and 1856. And the questions that came out of that, which are perfectly understandable and legitimate questions, are what happened to the cemeteries where they were previously, say at Santa Rosa Hospital or underneath Milan Park. And if you'll go back even further in my presentation to where I'm talking about all 5 of the Spanish colonial missions, talking about the burials in and around San Fernando Church, as well as burials in the Presidial Chapel, which was on Military Plaza. When we talk about all of those burial locations, while they moved to start burying in other places, in large measure, very few of the bodies in those locations were ever excavated and moved to a new location. There are probably around 2,200 to 2,500 burials that were made either in the Campo Santo or a Roman Catholic cemetery. And in going through the burials listed at San Fernando Cemetery #1, I can really only find evidence of about maybe 6 to 10, maybe 12 that were possibly moved. That means that literally there were thousands of bodies remaining in the ground down there. And that's, to our modern sensibility, that doesn't make sense. But the reality was that it was a common burial practice to bury people in sacred ground. But there was no distinction. Your body turned to dust, and that's the way that people looked at it and the church looked at it. And it was pretty common in the Roman Catholic Church, not just in the United States, but certainly back in Europe, that once a cemetery had been abandoned for a while, to turn it over to some other Catholic purpose, in this case, the building of a Catholic charity hospital. And so that's what happened on that site. The reality is that whenever work has gone on that property in the last 150 years, where they've gotten below the surface, they've almost always run into bodies. The most recent work that was done at the hospital in 2016, that we've, our CAR, Center for Archaeological Research, has been doing work with the hospital and with the families. And so there's been quite a number of burials that were encountered. And it also goes to another question, a series of questions that have already been turned in about, well, what happens on sites where the cemetery was abandoned but not moved, in the sense of bodies being moved and those bodies being discovered. And so then Santa Rosa Hospital is a great example, because what happened there, the law stepped in, as it should, as it's supposed to do, and we ended up, when I say we, I wasn't involved, but the descendants groups that represent the people that were buried there worked with the hospital and the court to come up with a plan about reinterring the bodies on site and making a memorial related to them. And so that's been done. Now, Milam Park, the situation with Milam Park, and we know all the people that were buried, more or less the people who were buried by San Fernando, because they kept records. We have hardly any records. If the city didn't keep records, or if they did, we've never found them. And literally, we know the names of maybe, probably less than 10 people who were buried in the Protestant or city cemetery, during the period of its operation. So one of the things that's really important about cemeteries, we know about those two, but it comes down to like the Winters Jackson Cemetery and about the Hockley Clay Cemetery, how important it is that we identify cemeteries in advance. In that way, it affords them a level of protection, because if nobody knows that there's a cemetery there, we can't stop it from being impacted. And sometimes we'll be lucky if we can actually step in after the fact. There may not be somebody there to see it and to stop it. So those are some of the larger questions that I saw people asking. And at this time, I will we'll see what else, what other questions are available, and try to answer those. So let's see, we have one from Mark, and he wants to know what the process is for reporting and repairing cemetery fixtures and stones that have been disturbed or obviously relocated by vandals. And I'd like to call on either Scott Baird and or Dr. David Carlson, if y'all might want to address that particular topic about what to do about existing cemetery furniture, headstones, and or fencing, et cetera, that may need repair. Thank you.
Can people hear me okay?
Yes, Dave.
Yes.
Okay, great. There was another question as well. One of the questions was about how to access cemeteries on private land. And so just to piggyback on some of the comments about the laws in Texas that were made by my friend and colleague, Scott, Dr. Baird, you have to get the permission of the private landowner in order to go onto the person's land, okay? That's just the way of it. If it's private property, it's private property. Once you file a notice of an abandoned cemetery, an abandoned or unknown cemetery goes to the Bexar County Clerk, to the deed records. And once that's filed, and once it's recognized that it is in fact a burial ground, then the law states that you are entitled to contact the private owner with 2 weeks notice and arrange a trip to go visit that cemetery. So this is a little bit dicey. You want to always be sure that you're not trespassing. If a cemetery is noted, it behooves you to go and do a deed search and try to discover if there is an easement, a way of accessing the cemetery. So Shawn Marceaux was showing these wonderful aerial photographs and maps of the Hockley Cemetery, which effectively had been abandoned. And there was this easement to access the cemetery. And over time, that had become blocked. It was simply the case that brush and shrubs and trees and all kinds of growth overran the area, and so it's incumbent to keep those easements clear. And working with Dr. Baird and with Clinton McKenzie at the Bexar County Historical Commission, we often find people in conflict because of easements and access points of cemeteries being blocked. Sometimes this is simply inadvertent, like there's construction going on and the construction crew will pile stuff in the easement because it's a space that's available, and they can't do that. So I hope that speaks a little bit to the legalities. Moving to Mark's question about the law, it is certainly the case that knowing desecration of a burial site is a criminal offense in Texas. Desecration is a Class A misdemeanor. If the lawyer chooses to prosecute, it could be criminal mischief, which is or putting graffiti or something like that at a human burial site is a state jail felony. The question is what people are going to do about it. What importance is attached to it? I can tell you that I drove out to the El Griego Las Perlas Cemetery. It's a small 1880s era Tejano, Mexicano ranch cemetery with just a handful of burials there. And I was appalled that vandals had basically toppled all of the stones, and there was desecration in that cemetery. But it's one of those things, trying to find a legal means of a redress for that kind of thing. So it behooves people to get organized if there's a particular cemetery that is a source of concern for you, and to form, however informally or formally, an association to kind of look after a particular cemetery.
Thank you, David. So I wanted to return to a couple of really good questions that have come in. First, I'd like to, one of the questions was from Belmo, which was, have any of the records on the Spanish Catholic cemeteries revealed those buried included African Americans, and which records? And it's an excellent question. As Dave Carlson knows, and I'm sure some of the other panelists, the Spanish kept pretty good records. And one of the things that they kept records of all the way up until 1821 was they had what they called castas information, or caste information, where they had divided colonial society by what mixtures of racial blood categories you were in. And while that's repugnant in one sense, it does allow us as individuals, as researchers, to be able to look at that castas information in the church records. So it's not just records related to burials, but also to baptisms as well as to marriages. And so when we look at the burial records for San Fernando that date between the 1730s all the way up until they stopped keeping track of castas data in 1821, the answer is yes. We see quite a number of burials of people who are identified as either Negro, Negro slave, free Negro, African, free African, or free or African slave. And they are making a distinction there, saying that when someone's called an African, it's because they have a slave that's been brought from Africa. versus a Negro slave, who is someone who has been born in the New World and is in enslaved status. Spanish society had both free and manumitted African-American members of society. There were a number of them, prominent ones here in San Antonio, Felipe Alua, in particular in the early 19th century. But we do have records. The Center for Archaeological Research is going to be publishing a report very soon on the Children's Hospital of San Antonio site. And it'll be online, and it will have all of the information on the burials from those cemeteries that we've extracted from the records, with all of the Costas information. So anyone that's interested, yourselves or others, can go in and search by any of those terms to see who these people are. And there are some really interesting stories that are behind, I'm sure, behind those entries. So I hope that answers that question. And then let me see here.
Clinton,
We're talking about families.
Clinton,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
I'd
right
like
ahead,
to
Scott.
add that Brother Locke, who's on the commission, historical in Baird County, says that the Archbishop or the Bishop, I'm sorry, I don't even know what it's called. Anyway, they have records that show that there are at least 1,200 people buried in the Alamo area, at the Alamo area alone. And that is duplicated by the Spanish government, who have their own records, and it's just across from, it's in Mexico, but not the United States. And they agree on something like 90%. And that's just one. I said, what about the other missions? He said, oh no, we've got records, both the Spanish, the Spanish, so whatever. Anyway, they have records for all 5 missions, and that they agree something like 75 to 80% of the numbers that are in there. And that, yes, there are Anglos, yes, there are Negroes. It's just mostly Hispanic, but those records are duplicated, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Scott. And what I can say about the mission records themselves, we have a goodly number of them. The largest proportion of people entered into the mission records as being buried there are Native Americans, though there are people that are Spanish as well as of African ancestry, and it's often noted in the records. We also have the burial records for the Alamo de Paris regiment that was stationed at the Alamo, and how it ended up getting the name Alamo. They also buried people there. So when we talk about that early slide that I showed that had all the little red circles, every single one of those Spanish institutions had burial rights on their property. And so there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Native American burials and other burials, including Spanish, African American, at these Spanish colonial sites. We, in some cases, know who they are, but we don't, and we may know basically where they might be buried, but we don't have a specific spot that we can point out in each one of those locations. That's an amazing resource that tells us a lot of information. Dr. Carlson, you wanted to say something?
I don't have much to add. I don't.
Dave, you're muted.
My apologies.
Sure.
Because of the Black Power movement and the civil rights movement in the United States, a lot of the terminology that was used in the colonial Spanish casta system, the caste system, may appear offensive, but these were the terms that were used, and some of those terms are still in currency in the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking parts of the world. So, for example, as Clint explained, you have negro. Sometimes the status of the person will be explicated, whether the person is free, freed, or meaning manumitted, or still enslaved. There's also a lot of use of the term, mulatto, mulata, the idea being that this is a presumed, Afro-European or Euro-African person. In addition, there's the term lobo or loba, literally wolf in Spanish, but this is understood to be an Afro-Indian or Native American African admixture. And so it's kind of a bewildering system, but when you look at the records at the Archdiocese, which are in the process of being digitized and are also available on microfilm, you can see the caste identifier that was used in a particular burial.
Yeah, Melanie, thank you very much, Dr. Carlson. We also had another great question from Arlene Ogletree about the cemeteries discussed that were referred to as family cemeteries, and were they strictly family cemeteries? And as a part of that, also discussing segregated cemeteries. And it's an excellent question. We know from the records associated, for example, with the Hockley Cemetery, and I believe also with Winters Jackson, and Everett can speak to this, just because it's a family cemetery, the family can choose who's buried there. And there are other, other non-Hockley clay or Winters Jackson burials in those cemeteries. But the purpose and the reason behind there being a Winters Jackson and a Hockley clay cemetery is because they were denied burial in a common cemetery with Anglos. There's a Wetmore Road Cemetery, for example, at the intersection of Higgins and Stall Road, and there were no African Americans buried in that cemetery during the period of segregation. You have a change in burial practice by community, and what I mean by that is in the Spanish period, you have people being buried together in common burial areas. But that changes when you get into the Anglo period into Texas, and certainly by the time of the end of the Civil War, it's segregated burials are the rule, and they continue to be the rule all the way in through the 1960s. Everett, did you want to speak on that too?
So yes, so Clint, you're absolutely correct about the change or evolution of tradition and practice. And I know specifically, for example, for the Hockley clay that through oral interviews, the family members indicated that whenever there was someone that couldn't afford a burial in town, that they would, if they knew the Hockleys or knew how to reach the Hockleys and ask for permission, that they would be allowed to bury folks that were not part of the family. And so essentially, they've explained that the south end of the cemetery was for family members, and the north end of the plot was for non-family members. And we also have another case in South Bexar County where there was a mixed marriage, white and black or mulatto of the priest family, and the husband was white and the wife was mixed race. And when the husband died in the 1920s, he was buried in Mission Park. But when the wife died, she was not allowed to be buried there. And so she was buried on the family land in the family plot in far south Bexar County. So you're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you very much, Everett. I appreciate that additional information. I think one of the things that I think is very important to me as a local historian, archaeologist, and researcher is that when we examine, any particular community, but certainly in the case of the African American community, the fact is that there's an African American presence in San Antonio from 1718 forward. And it's incredibly well documented. It's just not been incredibly well discussed. And these kinds of opportunities that we have today to show where resources are available, where research can be done, but also the need for as much additional information as we can get. One of the things that was so key to and beneficial to with the Winters Jackson and Hockley Clay cemeteries was the oral history and family history components. We don't have those for these much earlier ones because they've been lost to time and the vicissitudes of time. So as we move forward in looking at any number of small family type cemeteries throughout Baird County, African-American or otherwise, it's super important that we do what we can to try and document them from the family standpoint and family history standpoint. There are things that you can do. I grew up in Northeast San Antonio, and when in like about 1990, I've been traipsed around all over that area. It was at the time lots of old German farmers, and there were numerous cemeteries all over that area off of Higgins Road, heading out to Clawson Road between O'Connor, Judson, and I recorded a number of those cemeteries back in 1990. One of which was the Hockley Clay Cemetery. I didn't know who it was at the time, but I knew it was a cemetery because I grew up in the neighborhood. So those things that you can do to as an individual to make a difference in these in the study of cemeteries, families, family histories, and African American history and African American communities. There's plenty of work to be done. At this time, I'd like to see if any of the other members of the panel have things that they would like to address besides me as the moderator, and open it up. We've got just about 3 more minutes until we're done. Dr. Baird.
Yes. You and Dave heard from Jenny, I think a week or so ago, that Bexar County has been selected by one of 10 counties where growth in real estate developers is expected tremendously increasing over the next several years. So they have started, the state has started an inventory of any and all cemeteries that can be found in the county. So if anybody runs across a cemetery, I don't care if it's German or Black or Hispanic or whatever, please contact Clint. He's easy to contact, so we can get that documented. The main reason for that is that the developers would like to know where the cemeteries are before they start building on top of them. Any help I can get, I appreciate. Thanks.
Dr. Carlson.
Yeah, great point, Scott. It is important to document the cemetery. We have great resources for research in San Antonio and Bexar County. Obviously, Shawn Marceaux is with the Office of Historic Preservation from the City of San Antonio. The City of San Antonio maintains the central San Antonio Public Library location that has the Texana room up on the 6th floor. Excellent resource for researchers. We have private organizations like the San Antonio Historical and Genealogical Society that has a wonderful library. It is volunteer run, so you have to be mindful of that. They are not able to keep very regular hours because they're reliant on volunteers who are unpaid, who are keeping the library open, but they have a lot of work that has been done over the years on cemeteries. In addition, the state level resources mentioned by Scott, Dr. Baird, go to the Texas Historical Commission website, go to the Cemetery Preservation Project. There's any of a number of PDFs, forms that you can download, models for how to go about protecting a cemetery. it's really a lot of stuff that's available online. And speaking for the county, you can go to the Bexar County Spanish Archives at the Bexar Archives building. Because of social distancing and the pandemic, we prefer email and telephone communications. We're still, trying to get around the issues with the pandemic. But we can try to give you a hand. We can try to help you do a deed record search. We can pick up the phone and call someone who knows more about it than we do and get some input. So there are a lot of research sources to help people that are interested in cemeteries.
Thank you, Dr. Carlson. We're going to need to, that'll be our last public question, but I did want to let y'all know that, let all of the attendees know that unanswered questions will be addressed via the SAAACAM staff, and everybody's names and questions were recorded. So we will endeavor, if we did not answer your question between us and the SAAACAM staff, we will make sure that we get those questions answered. I'd like to thank SAAACAM for everything, and I'll turn it over to them to wrap this up. Thank you all for attending.
On behalf of the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum, I would like to thank our panelists, all of you who attended today, the SAAACAM board, staff, and volunteers for this program and everything you do to support your African American Community Archive and Museum. Please complete a survey of today's programming. You will see the link at the bottom of the screen. Thank you again, and have a great day.